Good afternoon, everyone, to all of you here and to the many who will be watching on camera. We come to Bible Story session 29, and it does seem a very long time since we last met, when we looked at the changes that happened after the conquests of Alexander when he conquered the Persian Empire. He brought, in fact, the whole of the ancient world to an abrupt end and turned the whole known world upside down. So although there's no direct mention of him in the Bible, we cannot ignore or bypass the cultural revolution that he initiated. Empires had come and gone in the ancient world, from the river-based empires of Egypt and Mesopotamia to the landed Persian Empire, with its intricate network of good roads for speedy communications from the many satraps to the royal presence. It had worked, but on an oriental style, at the unpredictable whim of the king alone. Everything changed following the incredible victories of Alexander the Great and his army. The center focus of the world events from now on would change from Persia to the eastern end of the Mediterranean Sea, before it moved further westwards and began to embrace Europe. Let's have a look at the map. You can see the vast area to the right of the Persian Empire, stretching through Afghanistan to northwest India, through what had been the Empire of Babylon, to the Mediterranean Sea, with Jerusalem on the coastline at the eastern end, stretching into Egypt, and then into Europe with Cyprus, Turkey, and the Greek cities. That's the original Greek empire that Alexander acquired. Well, he'd been a short-lived, phenomenal success, both militarily and culturally. As a boy, he had been taught by the great philosopher Aristotle, no less, and he was exposed to and excited by all the new Greek thinking of Socrates and Plato. These philosophers' thinking was completely new. It was based on human reason and logic rather than religious ideas. And in so doing, they examined all the old religious stories, such as Adam and Eve and the talking snake in the Garden of Eden, and turned them, and from them extracted their profound truths about human life, before discarding the stories as fanciful and useless. Now, this is Greek philosophy, and it was, and still is, secular in character, very different from the religious Jewish wisdom that we explored last time. The new Greek thinking world became the age of mathematics with Euclid, with geometry with Pythagoras, and an age of beautifully proportioned architecture and studies in the natural sciences with Aristotle, who asked, how do things work in the natural world? This was completely different from the old religious myths, which asked, why do things work the way they do? Hippocrates studied all the known problems of human sickness, which previously had always been attributed to punishment from the gods, but not anymore. Hippocrates claimed they were the results of physical causes which could be cured with medicines. Do enjoy the notes available from the so-called Testament of Solomon. It does try to compare the illnesses from the demons with the cures of Hippocrates. You first have to name the demon that caused the sickness, as that will give you power over him. And having named him and got rid of him, you can then prescribe the healing herb which will effect the cure. Such was the Testament of Solomon, and I commend the the extracts from it for your entertainment. Now, geography was the result of more studies in the natural world. And historical studies of human beings were developed too by Herodotus and Thucydides, while the wonder and the beauty of the human body was a delight to sculptors and artists galore. Humanism, that is secularism, was the prevailing interest, and beauty was its defining principle. The beauty of the human body was expressed and appreciated in the athletic games, where all athletes competed completely naked. And the Olympic Games came into being every 4 years as part of a big religious festival of Zeus. Every big city built a gymnasium for young, aspiring athletic men, including the young men of Jerusalem, to the great embarrassment of them, of course, all of whom had been circumcised. But the crowning glory of all this led to the development of the most beautiful language yet known in the world, Greek. It is still the language not only of imagination and abstract thinking, but also of precise and careful definition. And as an example, I'll give you the many Greek words for different types of love. There's the erotic side of love. There's the fellowship love that meets over the dinner table. And there's the caritas, the charity, the wanting to help people in less well circumstances than one's own. All descriptions of different types of love. That's just 3 of them. But in comparison, Latin had only one word for the lot, amor. Well, the Greek language flowered and produced both great poetry and very great drama, which the architects designed and built theatres, or amphitheatres, in the sloping sides of rocky hills. The first was built in the 4th century at Epidaurus in Greece. It sat 1,300 people, each one of whom had an equal view of the stage, and with acoustics enabling every one of them to hear everything clearly. The result of humanism, though, is always the weakening of religion, as it is today. But this was so for the many Greek gods and goddesses of Mount Olympus. Over the course of time, the games themselves became more important than the Zeus for whom they were enjoyed. Dramatic plays soon forgot the gods in whose honor they'd been written originally. The new god was public entertainment. For philosophy had demoted the power of the old myths, leaving behind only the old stories of gods romping around on Mount Olympus, which could now be held up to amusing contempt and ridicule, all in the age of reason. The tragedy was that, though, that these thoughtful people had not met Jewish monotheism, and they didn't for several centuries, not until the Christian missionaries with St. Paul had gone and done their work. So in this Greek period, even in Jerusalem, religion went into a period of decline, until for the Greeks it became a superstitious hangover. Oh, they still made sacrifices to the gods, yes, the official ones, just in case, as an insurance policy. But these days became merely an excuse for a public holiday and entertainment for the people. And sadly, it all sounds rather familiar, doesn't it? Now, I've spent a long time on this, but it is the real beginning of the New Testament world that we shall meet later on. In our last session before Easter, I gave you a brief outline of Alexander's short life and death. He was the man of this new age. But after his conquest of Egypt, his head was turned by the profound experience of his coronation as Pharaoh, by the Egyptian priests who declared him a god in human form. This had a big influence on him afterwards. His military successes throughout the Persian Empire were the result of careful thought, logic, and reason. He led his troops from the front all the way to northwest India before turning back to enjoy the results. But everywhere he went, he was treated like an oriental god, until he began to believe that he really was a god incarnate. He was only human after all. But then he began to behave like a Greek god and degenerated fast until, as you know, he died crazy and debauched at the age of 33. Well, Alexandria is given the glory for all this, but it was Aristotle who was the spiritual father of all that happened next. The process of Hellenization, or shall I say Greekification, swept the whole of the known world. And Greek people emigrated to all parts of the empire, especially retired soldiers who were given pensions of lands and money with which to build throughout the conquered territories, and who founded and colonized many new-style Greek cities all through Persia and modern Afghanistan, always with a characteristic long central north-south straight road in the middle, as at Palmyra and Jehoash, to name just two. Let's have a look at some of them. There's the Greek city of Palmyra, with the street called Straight, going north to south. Then off this street, on the left-hand side, through the various arches, you would meet the theatres, the agoras, the temples, the gymnasium, the library. And on the right-hand side, you'd see the entrances to all the grand houses. That was Palmyra. That was the theatre there, where 13,000 people, as in Greece, could see the central stage with ease, and the acoustics enabled them to hear without difficulty. Then we go to Jehoash. You may have been there. It's on the northwest side of the Sea of Galilee, but on the Jordan side politically. Again, you have the street called Straight, but this time it ends in a huge oval amphitheatre or forum for the people to meet. There was also a theatre there. That was a Jehoash as well. Again, similar style, same formula. So we leave all those. There was plenty of money for all this. Alexander had appropriated all the Persian wealth stored at Persepolis. And we're told that amounted to 120,000 talents of gold and 8,000 gold artifacts, enough to run an empire for many, many years. Predominantly, though, the Greek Empire was a culture of city dwellers, but only for men. Only men and boys were educated. Only men and boys could debate politics and vote for their leaders. Women and children counted for very little, unless, of course, they were rich. But rich people had no servants. In their homes, only slaves. The slaves, I'm afraid, were impoverished country dwellers who'd come to the cities but not flourished. Trade flourished with a universal language, a common currency, and good roads. The marketplaces everywhere were always busy. And our story will take us now to one particular city, Jerusalem. Jerusalem and the surrounding area of Judea came under the control of the Greek leaders of Egypt, the Ptolemy family. That was after the turmoil of Alexander's death and the sorting out. Egypt was now in need of wood from Lebanon to build ships that would sail easily across the Mediterranean from Alexandria to Athens. The new city of Alexandria soon became very influential in Jerusalem because it was so much closer geographically than Babylon or Susa or Persepolis. Many Jews went to live there to take advantage of the trading opportunities which extended easily southwards to Ethiopia and southern Africa, and also westwards in the Mediterranean, trading which was enhanced by the building of the Pharos Lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the world. You may have seen pictures of it. There it was, the guiding light to ships searching for harbour at Alexandria. As the Greek language became more and more widely used, so the enlightened Ptolemy dynasty of Egypt invited scholars to come from all sorts of places to Alexandria to become members of the new university and library there. They were encouraged to bring with them their own civil and religious scrolls. There's the university, built Greek style, of course, and its library. Library, the interior of the library, again very Greek in style, and in all those shelves were the scrolls that scholars had brought with them. They were encouraged to bring all their own civil and religious scrolls and tablets and make Greek translations of them so that they could be read by all. The translations, all on papyrus scrolls, were housed in Alexandria's famous new library, the largest the world had yet known. Jewish scholars, among others, went there from Jerusalem and made the Greek translation of their scriptures, which became known as the Septuagint, summarized by the Greek or the Roman numerals LXX. Why, we're not sure, but possibly it was the work of 70 scholars. This translation became standard and very familiar to all Greek-speaking Jews all over the world. And it certainly was the only version known and quoted by St. Paul in many years later in his letters. And this is the sort of translation that happened from the Hebrew writing on the left to the new Greek translation on the right. But the Jews of the diaspora, or the dispersion, kept themselves to themselves socially, to maintain their differences, to maintain their monotheism, their Sabbath keeping, and their laws in particular. They ate separately, that is, only with other Jews, because of their food laws, prohibiting them from eating pork, for example. They kept their separate identity with the rite of circumcision of their boys, all to a much greater extent than those who lived in Jerusalem. And by the time we get to the New Testament, people in society were known as either Jews or Greeks. But by contrast, the 4th century Jews in Jerusalem were not so particular. The wealthy aristocrats, priests, and educated sages were tremendously attracted to all the new fashions, the knowledge, the theatre, the athletics, the gymnastics, and the games. Don't forget, the conservative separatists were still in Judea. There seemed to be few tensions at first, but as time went by, their sons and grandsons, who were all now well educated, gradually became more and more tempted to become like the Greeks themselves, that is, apart from their religion. They liked the new fashions and embraced them wholeheartedly without forsaking their own monotheism. The Ptolemy rulers ruled over Judea for 120 years, maintaining a long period of calm, peace, and prosperity. But that's not the stuff of historical records. Life was very good for the rich and well-to-do, of course. Education flourished. Pilgrims flocked to the temple to bring their gifts, and Jerusalem was the most important city in the world for all Jews wherever they lived. There must have been local family feuds among the upper classes there, but we know nothing about them. The groups of separatists who were still there found life easier away from the city and out in the countryside, so it didn't cause too much trouble. Nevertheless, the inhabitants of Judea in the countryside were not oblivious of the outside world. The political upheavals, such as they were during these years, were between the Greek Ptolemies of Egypt and their rivals, the Greek Seleucids of Syria, who likewise wanted control of the Mediterranean coastline. Their skirmishes against each other meant that there were always soldiers around to be fed, housed, and entertained. Scholarship continued, no doubt spurred on by the activities in Alexandria. But alongside Greek, the classical writing in old-fashioned Hebrew did continue with no new additions. And so it became a closed language and final. And that meant the Pentateuch became closed and final too. In future, it would be copied as it was and recopied, but with nothing more added. It became scripture, and with it, all its 5 books were ascribed to the classical author Moses himself. The Greeks called it the Pentateuch, while the Jews kept the Hebrew word Torah. The prophetic books were still being edited, and the list was still open to new texts until the last one, the book of Daniel, was written. But a new development in Jewish literature began to appear as a result of so many people being able to read. They wanted more and more books to read. Subscription libraries were springing up, and so were the entertaining books to read. Lots of good stories with good, instructive themes for the education of all who would read them. We'll have a look at some of them in the next session, but for now, we'll restrain the temptation in order to complete our awareness of the fulfillment of Jewish wisdom, which we began to look at last time. Last time was a long time ago, thanks to Easter and the coronation. So here is a reminder. We looked at the 3 wisdom texts in the Old Testament, the first 9 chapters of the book of Proverbs, with its personification of wisdom, trying to link her with the Greek goddess Sophia. Sophia, which means wisdom. Next, we looked at the gloomy book of Ecclesiastes, but not for very long. And then the book of Job. Remember, Job did not find the answer to the problem of suffering because his questioning of God was halted when he remembered his own insignificance compared with God's omnipotence. So for Jews, wisdom remained profoundly religious in character, its total theme being the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. The greatest Jewish wisdom text was originally in the Old Testament, until Martin Luther dismissed it from all Protestant Bibles. He failed to realize that it was in Greek because it had survived in Alexandria, whereas the original Hebrew had been destroyed in all the troubles that erupted in the next 2nd century. Consequently, we must now look for it in the Apocrypha, Or if you have a Roman Catholic Jerusalem Bible, it's still in its original place in their Old Testament. It's known as the Book of Ecclesiasticus, or, alternately, the Wisdom of Joshua ben Sirach. Now, ben Sirach was an elderly and highly respected schoolmaster sage in Jerusalem around 200 BCE. He says of himself that he travelled widely when young for his own education. He'd worked hard, he'd prospered and grown rich, which then gave him the leisure to continue his studies. He lived in comfort in the cultured elite of Jerusalem and was a professor. His students all lived in his own house, but he charged them no fees. His book was written as a textbook for them, and in it he develops the theme of personified wisdom, who came into being before creation. That is in chapter 1. Wisdom, who is like a mother, in chapter 15. And in chapter 24, he gives us her autobiography. She came forth from the mouth of the Most High and was sent to Israel, where she took root and flourished. She invites everyone to come and learn from her. All this is in the book of the law that Moses commanded us as an inheritance for the family of Jacob. Well, this is the climax of Israel's wisdom, the law of God, the Torah. There was no more that could be said, and so it remains for all Jews today. Well, when the troubles came, ben Sirach's grandson escaped to Alexandria. And he tells us himself in a prologue to his translation, and I quote, it's very chatty. He wrote, "Many great teachings have been given us through the law and the prophets and the others that followed them, and for these we should praise Israel for instruction and wisdom. Now those who read the scriptures must not only themselves understand them, but must also, as lovers of learning, be able through the spoken and written word to help the outsiders. So my grandfather Joshua, who had devoted himself especially to the reading of them and had acquired considerable proficiency in them, was himself led to write something pertaining to instruction and wisdom, so that becoming familiar with his book, those who love learning might make even greater progress in living according to the law. You are invited, therefore, to read it with goodwill and attention, and to be indulgent in cases where, despite our diligent labour in translating, we may seem to have remembered some phrases imperfectly. And what was originally expressed in Hebrew does not have exactly the same sense when translated into another language. And this, of course, is the problem for all translators everywhere, both ancient and modern. But the grandson continued. When I came to Egypt in the 38th year of the reign of Euergetes and stayed for some time, I found opportunity for instruction and devoted myself with some diligence and labour to the translation of this book. During that time, I've applied my skill day and night to complete and publish the book for those living abroad who wish to gain learning and are disposed to live according to the law. And then he starts on his grandfather's book, which opens with the statement, all wisdom is from the Lord, and with him it remains forever. Well, I hope you enjoyed all that. Sounds so modern, doesn't it? But thanks to the hard work of Ben Sirach's grandson, we can now get a glimpse, a first-hand glimpse, of life in Jerusalem around 200 BCE. This was the time when the priests were at the peak of their powers in society, highly honoured and respected amongst all the cultural elite who lived there. In chapter 7, Ben Sirach outlines the respect that was due to the priests. And in chapter 45, he gives an exotic description of their gorgeous robes and their responsibilities in ordering the daily sacrifices. And then in chapter 50, the first 21 verses, there's a description of the daily grand procession of the high priest dressed in all his glory as he made his way to the altar in the temple where he made the offerings. And here I quote from chapter 50. The leader was the high priest Simon, son of Onias. How glorious he was, surrounded by the people as he came out of the house of the curtain. When he put on his glorious robe and went up to the holy altar, he made the court of the sanctuary glorious. When he received the portions from the hands of the priests, he was like a young cedar of Lebanon. All the sons of Aaron in their splendor held the Lord's offering in their hands before the whole congregation of Israel. And when finishing the service at the altar, he had held out his hand for the cup and poured a drink offering of the grape at the foot of the altar. They blew their trumpets of hammered metal and sounded a mighty fanfare before the Most High. And then all the people fell to the ground on their faces to worship the Lord, the Almighty, God Most High. Then the singers praised him with their voices in sweet and full-toned melody until the order of worship was ended. Then Simon came down and raised his hands over all the congregation to pronounce the blessing of the Lord with his lips and to glory in his name. And they all bowed down a second time to receive the blessing from the Most High. How very different from Greek philosophy. Well, the whole of Ben Sirach's book is chatty in style and includes much autobiographical detail, especially at the end. But I do not recommend it for easy reading. There are 52 chapters in all, and do remember, it is a school textbook after all. In the notes for you on the table, please help yourself, there is a selection of topics on the second side of the Ecclesiasticus paper that may interest you. But whatever you read, please do remember it reflects the thinking of the 2nd century BCE, particularly about women. Do enjoy chapter 26, verse 7. A bad wife is a chafing yoke. Taking hold of her is like grasping a scorpion. While in contrast, he approves of a silent wife who keeps a well-ordered home, has a beautiful face, and shapely legs. Well, the last wisdom book we have in the Apocrypha is called The Wisdom of Solomon. It wasn't written by Solomon, of course, neither is it a teaching manual, but a scholarly attempt written in Alexandria and originally in Greek, that is not a translation, possibly about 100 BCE. It's an attempt to unite Jewish and Greek thinking. It's quite easy to read if you're interested. But for me, chapters 6 to 9 are the most interesting, with its description of personified wisdom. In 6:25 we read, "She is a breath of the power of God." Again, a foretaste of the New Testament equating wisdom with the Son and the Holy Spirit. Well, after all that, and before we finish today, we must get back to our story. Well, while the Greek Ptolemy dynasty ruled over Jerusalem, as I've told you, there was peace and everything flourished. There had been occasional skirmishes between the Ptolemies of Alexandria and the Seleucids of Syria, again Greeks. They ruled over the east from Damascus. And remember, that was Israel's ancient enemy. But in 198 BCE, King Antiochus III, the Great, fought and won the Battle of Panium. He won it. And after the battle, Jerusalem found itself still as Greek as always, but now under the rule of the Seleucid kings of Syria. And that's where we shall continue next time on Sunday, the 4th of June. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching. Goodbye. If you'd be interested in a little bedtime reading before we meet again on the 4th of June, I recommend the second book of Maccabees, from chapter 4, verse 17, as far as chapter 10, verse 9. But you'll have to find an apocrypha, hopefully in a modern translation, before you can enjoy it. Not compulsory, but if you're interested. Goodbye.